Your protocols are overkill, Natalie. This isn't a nuclear facility. Derek Thornton leaned back in his father's chair, the chair that had belonged to the CEO for 30 years, and laughed like I'd told a joke. We're streamlining operations. Your safety theater is exactly the kind of bureaucratic waste holding this company back. I'd spent 8 years building compliance systems that kept 300 workers safe and regulators satisfied. Derek had spent 3 weeks shadowing departments before deciding he understood everything. Effective Monday, I'm assuming the safety director position, he announced. Dad agrees it's time for fresh perspective. Gerald Thornton, founder, CEO, and father of the man dismantling my life's work, nodded from the corner of his office without meeting my eyes. I said nothing. What was there to say? The decision had been made. My expertise was being replaced by bloodline. I collected my belongings, signed the severance paperwork, walked out of Pinnacle Chemical Solutions for what I assumed was the final time. 2 weeks later, a federal inspector walked into the boardroom during an executive meeting. We've completed our facility audit. I'm here to discuss a $2.8 million fine for non-compliance with environmental safety regulations. The room went silent. Additionally, we need to speak with the named safety officer on file. Criminal negligence charges may apply depending on our findings. Derek straightened his tie, smiled that confident smile I'd grown to despise. That's me. I'm the safety director. The inspector looked at him, looked at the documentation in her hands, looked back at Derek. Mr. Thornton, are you aware that accepting named safety officer designation creates personal legal liability for all compliance failures during your tenure? Derek's smile faltered. Gerald Thornton's breathing stopped audibly. The inspector continued. The violations we've documented began 18 days ago, precisely when your name replaced the previous officers on regulatory filings. She set a folder on the table. You'll want to contact your personal attorney immediately. I watched all of this from home through a video call Derek didn't realize remained active on the conference room system. The system I'd installed. The system he called unnecessary surveillance waste. Funny how overkill becomes essential when federal investigators start asking questions. Now, before I reveal exactly what violations that inspector found, and trust me, Derek's legal situation got significantly worse from there, let me ask you something. If you've ever had your expertise dismissed by someone who inherited their position rather than earning it, if you've ever watched someone dismantle what you built and waited for reality to catch up with their arrogance, this is your channel. We showcase real experiences from people who were underestimated until circumstances proved otherwise. We're creating something here, a community that understands competence eventually reveals itself, especially when incompetence creates catastrophic consequences. If you're among the first 1,000 subscribers, you're establishing the foundation with us. That button is waiting. Now let me explain the 8 years that led to the most expensive lesson Derek Thornton ever received. My name is Natalie Quinn. I'm 38 years old, happily dating a wonderful man named Ryan for the past 3 years, and until recently, I was the Director of Safety and Environmental Compliance at Pinnacle Chemical Solutions, one of the largest specialty chemical manufacturers in the Midwest. This is the account of how nepotism replaced expertise, and why federal regulators ensured that replacement cost millions more than. Chemical manufacturing isn't an industry that tolerates carelessness. The substances we handle can ignite, explode, corrode, or poison. One miscalculated process parameter can injure dozens. One neglected maintenance protocol can devastate communities for generations. I understood these stakes viscerally from my first day in the field. My father worked at a chemical plant in Ohio when I was 12. An equipment failure during his shift released chlorine gas into a production area. 3 workers died. My father survived but carried respiratory damage for the rest of his life. That experience shaped everything about my career trajectory. I studied environmental engineering with a focus on industrial safety, completed every certification available for hazardous materials handling, joined Pinnacle Chemical at 29 after 5 years of consulting work that had given me exposure to dozens of facilities and hundreds of potential failure modes. Gerald Thornton hired me personally. "Natalie, your background is exactly what we need," he explained during my interview. "Pinnacle has grown faster than our safety systems. I want someone who can build infrastructure that prevents disasters rather than responding to them. Prevention requires investment, protocols that might seem excessive until they're needed. I'd rather explain cautious spending than casualties." I believed him then. For 7 years, that belief seemed justified. Building safety systems at Pinnacle became the most fulfilling work of my professional life. I developed comprehensive protocols covering every production process, training programs that ensured workers understood not just what to do, but why each procedure mattered, documentation systems that could demonstrate compliance to any regulatory body that asked. The results spoke clearly. 0 OSHA recordable incidents for 6 consecutive years, an achievement nearly unheard of in chemical manufacturing. Environmental compliance scores consistently exceeded minimums. Insurance premiums decreased annually as our safety record established itself. Gerald acknowledged my contributions regularly. "Natalie, what you've built here is remarkable. Our competitors have incident rates 10 times higher. The systems work because leadership supports them. That starts with you. And it continues because you maintain standards when pressure suggests cutting corners." That mutual respect sustained me through demanding seasons. Ryan entered my life during year 5 at Pinnacle. We met through mutual friends at a dinner party. He worked as a software architect, analytical in ways that complemented my systematic thinking. "You seem to actually enjoy your work," he observed during our first real conversation. "I protect people from dangers they can't see. It matters." That's either noble or exhausting, usually both. He appreciated that honesty. Our relationship developed steadily from there. By year 7, we'd discussed futures together. Marriage seemed likely eventually, though neither of us felt urgency about formalizing what already functioned beautifully. Work remained demanding but manageable. Life felt balanced in ways I'd never quite achieved before. Then Derek Thornton returned from graduate school. Derek was Gerald's only child. He'd pursued an MBA at a prestigious program funded entirely by family wealth, following an undergraduate degree in business administration that had required minimal effort. I'd met him briefly during company events over the years, pleasant enough socially, completely uninterested in operational details. His return to Pinnacle as Vice President of Strategic Operations signaled something I should have recognized immediately: succession planning. Gerald was 67. His energy had diminished noticeably over the previous 2 years. The company he'd built from nothing needed eventual leadership transition. Derek represented his only option. Within weeks of his arrival, Derek began evaluating departments with the confidence of someone who'd learned about business from case studies rather than experience. Production efficiency, staffing ratios, budget allocations. Everything became subject to optimization recommendations from someone who'd never actually operated anything. Safety landed on his radar by month 2. "Natalie, I've been reviewing your department's expenditures. The numbers seem disproportionate to actual incident rates." Low incident rates are the outcome of those expenditures, cause and effect. Perhaps, or perhaps we're spending more than necessary to achieve results that would occur anyway. Chemical safety doesn't work that way. Underinvestment creates latent risks that compound until catastrophic failure. That sounds like justification for maintaining bureaucratic empire. The conversation told me everything about what was coming. Derek spent the following month building his case against my department. He requested historical data on every protocol I'd implemented, questioned training schedules that had been established for years, suggested that regulatory requirements were minimums rather than standards. I documented every interaction carefully. Something told me these records would matter eventually. Gerald remained conspicuously absent from these discussions. The few times I tried raising concerns directly with him, he deflected toward trusting Derek's judgment. "He's learning the business, Natalie. Let him ask questions." Questions are fine. Undermining safety infrastructure is different. I'm sure he'll understand the importance once he sees more. Gerald didn't want to see what was happening. Acknowledging it would mean confronting the reality that his son wasn't qualified for the role he'd been given. Parental blindness. I'd witnessed it in other family businesses. Ryan noticed my stress increasing during this period. "You seem distracted lately. Something happening at work?" The CEO's son is positioning to eliminate my department, or at least reduce it to ineffectiveness. Can he actually do that? With his father's support, he can do almost anything. What happens to the company if he does? Eventually, something bad. Safety systems fail quietly until they fail catastrophically. Ryan processed this silently. What happens to you? I get replaced by someone willing to tell Derek what he wants to hear. The prediction proved accurate within 6 weeks. The termination meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Gerald orchestrated everything. Gerald attended but barely spoke, his presence lending authority to decisions his son had already made. "Natalie, we're restructuring the safety and compliance function. Your position is being eliminated." Eliminated or reassigned. I'll be assuming direct oversight of safety matters going forward. Your expertise is appreciated but no longer required. Jarek, named safety officer designation, carries legal requirements, certification, training, demonstrated competency, and regulatory frameworks. I've completed online certifications sufficient for the role. Online certifications don't substitute for field experience. Perhaps not in your view, but regulatory requirements specify qualifications, not methods of obtaining them. He'd researched just enough to feel confident, the dangerous zone of partial knowledge. I turned to Gerald. "This decision creates substantial risk for Pinnacle. I've documented compliance requirements extensively. Whoever assumes this role needs to understand the systems maintaining our regulatory standing." Gerald couldn't meet my eyes. "Derek will have access to your documentation. I'm sure the transition will be smooth." Smooth. I'd spent 8 years building infrastructure that protected 300 workers and satisfied federal regulators. It was being handed to someone who considered safety protocols bureaucratic theater. I signed the severance paperwork without argument. Fighting wouldn't change the outcome. The decision had been made based on family loyalty rather than organizational need. The best I could do was document everything and wait for consequences I knew would eventually arrive. The 2 weeks following my departure provided troubling glimpses into Derek's leadership. Former colleagues reached out discreetly, shared observations they found concerning. Training schedules reduced to essential personnel only, a category Derek defined narrowly. Documentation requirements relaxed because excessive paperwork discourages efficiency. Equipment inspection intervals extended to reduce production interruptions. Each change individually seemed minor. Collectively, they dismantled the safety infrastructure I'd spent years constructing. Ryan listened to my concerns each evening. "Can you report this to someone? Regulators, maybe?" Reporting without evidence of actual violations would look like retaliation, disgruntled former employee making accusations. So you just wait? I document what I'm hearing, wait for something concrete, then determine whether intervention is warranted. That sounds frustrating. It's excruciating. People I care about work in that facility. They trust that someone is protecting them. Someone was protecting them, now someone else is pretending to. The distinction mattered more than Ryan probably realized. Week 2 brought the concrete evidence I dreaded. An environmental monitoring system triggered an alert I still had access to, an oversight in credential revocation that Derek's team hadn't addressed. Volatile organic compound levels in a production area exceeded permissible exposure limits, not catastrophically, but enough to trigger mandatory reporting requirements. Requirements Derek apparently chose not to follow. Federal environmental regulations are remarkably specific about reporting timelines. Certain threshold exceedances require notification within 24 hours. Documentation must be filed within 7 days. Corrective action plans must be submitted within 30 days. The alert I received showed the exceedance occurring on a Tuesday. By the following Tuesday, no filings had appeared in the regulatory database I still had access to through my professional memberships. Derek had either deliberately ignored reporting requirements or remained unaware they existed. Either interpretation suggested serious compliance failures. I consulted with a former colleague from my consulting days, someone who now worked at the regional EPA office. Hypothetically, if a facility experienced reportable emissions and failed to notify within required timelines, that's a serious violation, especially for facilities with existing compliance agreements. What triggers investigation? Complaints, routine audits, pattern recognition from monitoring networks, sometimes whistleblower information, if it's credible. What makes information credible? Documentation, specific dates and readings, evidence that the informant has legitimate knowledge of operations. I had all of that. The question was whether using it constituted appropriate whistleblowing or vindictive retaliation. Ryan helped me work through the ethical dimensions. If workers are being exposed to harmful substances without proper protection, that's not retaliation, that's protecting people. But I wouldn't even know about it without access I probably shouldn't still have. How you learned about it is separate from whether the information is accurate. If there's genuine danger, does the source really matter? I thought about my father, the chlorine exposure that damaged his lungs, the 3 workers who didn't survive. Those families had trusted that someone was maintaining safety systems. Someone had failed them. I wouldn't fail the workers at Pinnacle the same way. I filed a formal complaint with the Environmental Protection Agency the following morning. The documentation included everything I could provide: historical monitoring data, current alert readings, evidence of unreported exceedances, timeline analysis showing when reporting should have occurred. I also included information about protocol changes implemented after my departure: training reductions, documentation relaxations, inspection interval extensions. The pattern suggested systematic compliance degradation rather than isolated oversight. EPA responses typically take weeks. Bureaucratic processes move deliberately. But my complaint apparently coincided with something already in motion. I learned later that Pinnacle had been flagged for random audit weeks before my termination. The inspection was already scheduled. My complaint simply added specific focus areas the investigators might otherwise have missed. The inspection occurred 12 days after my departure, 14 days after Derek assumed the named safety officer role. Federal Inspector Sarah Vaughn arrived at Pinnacle's facility at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday. She spent 6 hours examining documentation, interviewing personnel, and reviewing monitoring systems. By 3 p.m., she'd requested an emergency meeting with executive leadership. The meeting I watched through the video conferencing system Derek called unnecessary surveillance waste. The boardroom filled with people accustomed to controlling outcomes. Gerald Thornton, Derek Thornton, legal counsel, operations managers, finance executives. Inspector Vaughn remained standing while everyone else sat. "We've completed our preliminary audit. I need to discuss findings that will significantly impact this facility's operational status." Gerald's expression tightened. "What kind of findings?" "Multiple category violations, unreported emissions exceedances, inadequate training documentation, equipment inspection lapses, environmental monitoring system irregularities." She opened a folder. The aggregate fine for documented violations is $2.8 million. This represents minimum statutory penalties. Depending on investigation outcomes, additional assessments may apply. The room went completely silent. Additionally, we need to address the named safety officer designation on your regulatory filings. Current documentation shows Derek Thornton assumed this role 18 days ago. Derek straightened, attempted to project confidence. That's correct. I'm the safety director. Inspector Vaughn studied him with professional detachment. Mr. Thornton, are you aware that named safety officer designation creates personal legal liability for all compliance failures occurring during your tenure? I understand the role carries responsibilities. The violations we've documented began precisely when your name replaced the previous officers on regulatory filings. The unreported exceedances, the training documentation failures, the inspection lapses. She paused. All of these occurred on your watch, under your authority, with your signature on operational certifications. Derek's confidence visibly evaporated. The previous officer left documentation that I was still reviewing. Reviewing documentation doesn't discharge responsibility for compliance. You accepted the designation, you signed the certifications, you bear the liability. Gerald intervened. Surely there's discretion in how these matters are handled. Mr. Thornton, your son certified facility compliance while systematic violations were occurring. Either he knew about the violations and certified falsely, or he certified without knowing, which constitutes negligent misrepresentation. Inspector Vaughn closed her folder. Both scenarios have criminal implications. I recommend personal legal counsel, immediately. The aftermath unfolded over the following months with devastating precision. The EPA fine stood at $2.8 million, payable within 90 days. Pinnacle's insurance covered portions, but significant costs fell directly on operating reserves. Criminal referrals for Derek's false certifications proceeded through regulatory channels. He ultimately avoided prosecution through a consent agreement that barred him from holding compliance roles for 10 years. His career in chemical manufacturing ended before it meaningfully began. Gerald Thornton's position became untenable. Board members who'd tolerated his succession planning couldn't ignore the catastrophic outcome. He resigned as CEO within 6 months, retaining only his equity position. Pinnacle survived, but barely. New leadership implemented emergency compliance measures, brought in consultants to rebuild what Derek had dismantled. Some of those consultants reached out to me. Natalie, we're trying to understand the systems that existed before the transition. Your documentation is extensive, but we need context. Happy to help. Consulting rates apply. They paid premium rates for expertise Derek considered worthless. The workers I'd spent years protecting remained safe, not because of anything Derek did, but because the systems I'd built had enough resilience to survive his brief tenure. Barely. Another month of his optimization might have produced actual injuries rather than just regulatory violations. Ryan and I celebrated the resolution with dinner at our favorite restaurant. So they fired you for being too thorough, then got fined millions for not being thorough enough. Essentially, yes. And the guy who called your work overkill is now banned from compliance roles. For a decade. That's almost poetic. It's almost preventable. If Gerald had trusted expertise over bloodline, none of this happens. Ryan raised his glass. To expertise eventually being recognized, even when recognition requires federal intervention. 6 months after the inspection, I received an unexpected phone call. Gerald Thornton, the man who let his son dismantle my department without intervention. Natalie, I owe you an apology I should have offered months ago. I listened without responding. I let family loyalty blind me to what Derek was doing. I knew you'd built something exceptional. I watched him tear it down and convinced myself he'd learn eventually. Learning usually requires smaller consequences than $2.8 million. The fine was almost secondary. Watching my son face criminal investigation, understanding that I enabled every decision that led there. His voice carried weight I hadn't heard before. I'm sorry for all of it. Gerald, I appreciate that, but apologies don't rebuild what was destroyed. No, they don't, which is why I'm calling about something else. He explained that Pinnacle's new leadership wanted me to return, not just as safety director, as vice president with operational authority to implement whatever systems I deemed necessary. The offer was substantial: more money, more influence, more resources than I'd ever had. I declined. Gerald, I've accepted a position elsewhere, a company that values safety infrastructure proactively rather than after federal intervention. I understand. But I'll recommend former colleagues who could serve well, people I trained, people who understand the systems. That would be helpful. We ended the call cordially. Whatever resentment I'd carried had faded over the months. Gerald had been foolish, not malicious. Parental love had clouded professional judgment. The consequences fell mostly on Derek anyway. My new role started 3 weeks later, Chief Safety Officer at a pharmaceutical manufacturing company. Different industry, similar stakes. Leadership that considered compliance non-negotiable rather than optional. Ryan helped me unpack my new office. So you went from being mocked for overkill to being recruited because of thoroughness. Funny how that works. Derek Thornton probably doesn't find it funny. Derek Thornton is legally prohibited from caring about it professionally. Sometimes the universe delivers exactly the outcome arrogance deserves. Derek called my protocols overkill, said safety systems were bureaucratic waste, took my role with confidence borrowed from his father's authority. 18 days later, federal investigators arrived. The named safety officer designation he'd proudly claimed became the signature on his professional destruction. Overkill, it turns out, is just another word for adequate, and adequate only seems excessive to people who've never witnessed what happens without it. If this connected with something in your own experience, if you've ever watched someone dismiss expertise they didn't understand, if you've ever waited for consequences to catch up with arrogance that displaced competence, subscribe and become part of what we're building here. Every day we share experiences of people who understood that being right eventually matters, even when it takes federal intervention to prove it. Drop a comment telling me about a time your overkill turned out to be exactly what was needed. I read every single response. And check out that video right there, another experience you absolutely need to hear. Until next time, build systems that protect people, document everything, and remember that compliance isn't bureaucracy. It's the difference between safety and catastrophe.